So you've just finished watching Season 3 of JoJo's bizarrely big bicep adventure, and boy was it a fun ride. As you watch Dio's body burn to dust in the sun, you know that this trilogy, as it were, is over, and it's time not only for a new season and protagonist, but time for a new arc entirely. Dio's presence as the main antagonist has loomed over every season so far, and now, at long last, he's utterly defeated. So, what do now? Anyway, you're sitting on your sofa, covered in crisps or beer or whatever it is you stuff your face with while watching anime, and you feel a sort of disquiet about having to say goodbye to the characters you just spent 72 episodes with. Especially Avdol, and maybe Iggy, and who's that guy on the right again? The cherry guy? But you're ready for Season 4. As ready as you'll ever be. And it hits you. Like a soft, pastel slap in the face. The drastic tonal and stylistic shift between Season 3 and Season 4 is, to me, one of the most fascinating experiences as a viewer of JoJo. And for some, especially those unfamiliar with the manga, it's jolting. So today I want to delve right into exactly how this shift was executed in the Season 4 premiere, and also why it was so necessary. Before we talk about what made Season 4 so special, we do need to look back at the macho world of Stardust Crusaders.
Oh my god!
While I'd argue that JoJo is at its best when breaking from conventions, Season 3 deserves praise for sticking to a pulpy and recognizable villain of the week structure, which is very strong. Every episode promised to fight with a new stand enemy, tension riding on just how the hell they were gonna get out of this one, before our hero's inevitable yet satisfying victory, leaving us safe and happy in the knowledge that the next episode, and the next would repeat this structure seemingly ad infinitum. This formula is so persistent, in fact, that when you Google Stardust Crusaders episodes to skip comes up before episode guide. And don't get me wrong, I see and have nothing but love for this season, but by the end, narrative structure was wearing a little bit thin, you know? It had to change, or at least evolve into something more sophisticated. Of course, Season 3 wasn't just safe though, it was also special in that it added a road movie element, and even a buddy movie element to JoJo. The show was no longer primarily about muscly dudes fighting each other, though we are not short on muscle here. It became a bit more character-focused, with the overarching structure of fighting a greater evil merely being the stage for what is ultimately remembered as a lads-on-tour adventure. Of course, with some of the biggest and baddest fights we've seen in JoJo. I think Polnareff's line at the end sums it up pretty well when he says, "There were many hardships, but it was a lot of fun." Therefore, while structure had to be rethought, this balance of action and friendship-related pathos worked, so it had to remain and even be leaned into a little bit more. And what about the style in Season 3? Looking back from the cool Technicolor haze and svelte character designs and amazing clothes of later installments, Season 3 looks like the most overtly masculine part to date. I've even seen the faces in this season described as brick-like, which I thought was funny but also strangely accurate. Furthermore, there's something so traditionally masculine about Jotaro's ruthless self-control throughout. He's often looking out from under his hat like he's judging the situation and the people around him, without giving away too much of himself. But we'll talk more later on about the hat as a symbol. It'll be good, so stick around for that. Before anybody jumps in and says, "But it's shonen, it's meant to be manly, it's meant to have lots of fights. Masculinity is a big part of this kind of genre." And I know this. And I don't think that all this manliness is really a bad thing. When you're constantly fighting life or death battles, it's also probably pretty necessary to have unyielding stoicism and banter in the face of hardship, because otherwise you would probably, have a mental breakdown or something. But keeping that sort of tone indefinitely does become limiting, as anything does. Enter Season 4, my favorite season, where we ditched the chiseled beefcakes and realistic color palette, because who needs those anyway, for something else entirely. I think the first surprise when moving from Season 3 to Season 4, whether you notice it or not, is in fact the sound design. Season 3 ends with Jotaro placing a Polaroid of his pals in his pocket and the plane flying off into the sunset. Accompanying this image was an orchestral crescendo, a brass fanfare, making this feel almost like the end of a western or something. It's very cinematic and grand. Dare we say, it's manly too. And then what's the first thing we hear in Season 4? A poppy radio jingle. While the orchestra from the end of Season 3 had a grand scale and made us feel like all was well in the entire world, a pleasant kitchen radio noise like this suggests a different kind of idyll, that all is well in one tiny place. Immediately, the perspective has shifted to something much smaller and domestic. Furthermore, the sounds of the radio, the drums, the mic'd up voices are all electric, telling us that this setting is a more modern world too. Indeed, 11 diegetic years have passed since Season 3. But please, can we talk about the colour palette straight away, because, it's so beautiful. While expressive use of colour is present throughout JoJo's bizarre adventure, Season 4 turns this up to 11 with great effect. To signal this, the first shot in Season 4 contains a yellow sky, and to go with this, we have a pastel green road. These colours, while not reflecting reality, somehow tell us that it's morning. And it's this expressionism that defines Season 4 for so many people, including myself. A voice on the radio then tells us it's morning and welcomes us, the viewer, to Morio, and indeed to this new season. The radio host even describes himself as your neighbour. This is followed by some nice idyllic morning imagery, evoking a sort of white picket fence America kind of feeling. And then the sound design does something really interesting. The radio cracks out, blurring the music into this atonal white noise. And then a second after this, the camera pans out to reveal that the hand on the table has been severed from its body. This is where the Twin Peaks fan in my brain gets really excited. It's not just horror, it's the surreal. It's creepiness mixed with small-town sweetness, and it's very well done. And then we transition to the title card, followed by a picturesque valley. Thus, in 1 minute, we're given a quiet idyll, a sense of locality, and also a sense of underlying dread. But there is one important element missing, a hero. Who's that in the back of the taxi? This is where the change in art style becomes most apparent. In fact, Jotaro is almost unrecognizable with his smoothed out face and white suit. But his hat and its position over his eyes tells us exactly who this is. He's on screen for over half a minute, in fact, before we even see his eyes, emphasizing that despite his new, lighter, softer outfit, his dark broodiness is still very much present. With that little nugget of nostalgia, we're back to Morio. A voiceover belonging to a young boy starts, and he begins to recount his nerves on his first day of high school, again portraying this theme of the quotidian. The boy, of course, is Koichi, and he intermittently acts as a sort of narrator. It makes sense to give him this role, in fact, as he sort of functions as the everyman character of the season, the small-town observer being introduced to all this madness at once. And he's a pretty passive guy, and a pretty passive character in the narrative, at least until he gains stand powers later on and starts to look like some kind of troll doll. But at this point, he is definitely the everyman. Anyway, Koichi is so nervous here that he bumps into our Jotaro and drops his books. And so the first thing that we see Star Platinum do in this season is help a schoolboy pick up his belongings from the pavement, which is just wonderfully mundane. This event contrasts refreshingly and comically with just how powerful we know Star Platinum and Jotaro to be. So I thought it was very clever. We find out that Jotaro is looking for the Higashikata household. And so we're then introduced to the central protagonist of the season, Higashikata Josuke. And like Star Platinum, Josuke makes a surprisingly unaggressive entrance. Indeed, Josuke first appears kneeling on the floor before a group of older boys, or presumably older boys, standing over him. He's a tall, handsome fella like Jotaro, but his physical prowess is sort of hidden here in his passive stance. The older boys here are provoking Josuke, asking him what he's doing, and Josuke explains that he's watching a turtle that's just woken up from hibernation. This successfully establishes Josuke's whimsical side. Crucially, whimsy is one of these key traits that Josuke possesses that are not traditionally masculine. And I'm underlining traditionally here, guys, because there's nothing unmanly about a bit of whimsy, okay? We're just talking classic tropes for the sake of the analysis, so don't come at me, please. I'm very small. So Josuke's whimsical, we get that, and he says twice in this scene that he's actually afraid of the turtle, which really does subtly challenge the ideal of the strong male hero. As Araki recently stated in an interview, if the main character of Stardust Crusaders is like the hero of Greek myth, then the main character of Diamond is Unbreakable is the friend next door. Of course he's not as manly as Jotaro. He's not a bloody Hercules. He's just a guy. Going back to the scene, one of the nasty boys smashes the turtle and threatens Josuke, ordering him to remove his clothes and give him his money. In response to this, Josuke simply bows low and apologizes. Not very Joestar behavior. We did see Jotaro being submissive at one point in Stardust Crusaders, but it was because he literally had to in order to defeat a stand user and keep his friends safe. You probably remember the Jotaro Bridge incident. No, not that Jotaro Bridge, this one. Seeing Josuke's reaction to the scene, Jotaro immediately makes a negative judgment of him here, walking away and even saying that Josuke put himself in harm's way by dressing elaborately. I think the age difference really comes into play here. Because he is a bit older, Jotaro is quick to scoff at a younger man acting and dressing in a way that he feels is foolish. Either way, it's clear that he doesn't quite respect Josuke yet. I mean, the guy's only been on screen for like a minute or two, so he's still to prove himself both to Jotaro and to the audience. Jotaro then hears Josuke's name and realizes he's the guy he's been looking for, and we see a close-up shot emphasizing Josuke's badges, the largest of which are a heart and a peace symbol. Not quite as intimidating as Jotaro's chains and open palm badge from Season 3. In fact, it wouldn't be a stretch to say that Josuke's badges represent his softer and more quote-unquote effeminate nature. In addition, I can't help but notice that the anchor on Josuke's collar is reminiscent of the symbol associated with Prince, whose androgynous approach to fashion is probably a big influence here. What's for certain though is that these symbols reflect the restorative power of Josuke's stand, Shining Diamond, which can break things but also put them together. It is in part a healing power, which sort of contrasts with the more destructive stand of Jotaro. Even more important than Josuke's clothes, his hair is also a clear symbol. Indeed, Josuke continues to acquiesce and be submissive until they insult his hairdo. And this is when we see the all-important other side of him. To Jotaro's surprise, Josuke produces a stand and punches the guy who insulted him, confirming to Jotaro and to the viewer that he's a force to be reckoned with. Here we see Josuke looking up from under his hair in anger, just as Jotaro has been seen to look out from under his hat. It's a very clear parallel that really excited me when I noticed it, and if you watch the episode again with that in mind, it's really interesting. Indeed, like Jotaro's hat, Josuke's hair is a performative expression of his sense of self, but also something he kinda hides behind. But of course, this episode does a lot more than just expose the similarities between these two characters. It marks a progression. Indeed, this scene excellently shows Josuke's balance of masculine and feminine qualities, which arguably establish him as a bit more evolved, or at least more complex, than previous JoJos. Even physically, for example, in this shot his shoulders are held back in a sort of square shape and he's filled with rage, but his small waist and heart-shaped hairdo are also apparent. As I mentioned, Josuke's stand powers also reflect this evolution. While Jotaro's stand could only destroy, Josuke's can destroy and repair. And after the fight, we see Josuke pick up the turtle, which has been miraculously healed. We also see the boy's face heal as well, in a sort of twisted version of its original self. So clearly, stand powers in this season will be expanded upon to become more sophisticated. Jotaro, who's the only onlooker able to see the stand, then approaches Josuke. We then get a really nice shot of the two JoJos looking out from under their respective hats at each other. before Josuke gets a fright and we're reminded that he's still a child in this situation. So they talk, and Jotaro tells Josuke that Josuke is actually Joseph Joestar's son, and we hear a familiar musical theme from Stardust Crusaders playing quietly in the background. Anybody who wasn't quite won over by the new aesthetic should be getting a little bit excited by now. No longer angry, Josuke quickly snaps back to being docile, apologizing to Jotaro for simply being born. Jotaro is naturally shocked by his lack of aggression here, saying that he expected the interaction to end in a punch to the face. This subtly illustrates just how Jotaro is accustomed to resolving things with violence. And furthermore, it suggests that in this season, the show will be less focused on resolution through violence as a plot device. And I know, I hear you. Of course, fighting is integral to JoJo's bizarre adventure, and it always has been. But we do see a little bit more structural nuance in this season, as I said in the introduction, and to be honest, I love it. Anyway, being handsome chaps, the men are interrupted by a group of men fawning over Josuke. And there's a great shot here where we get Jotaro's hat dominating the frame, looming over Josuke, who's garnering all this female attention as the new JoJo. Josuke does a very lackluster and ineffective job of fending off the women, so Jotaro firmly orders them to have your stupid talk about hair later. Again, Josuke's fierce side surfaces, and it's clear from the girls' reactions that Josuke's vanity about his hair is well known in the community. Jotaro even says, "I'm not insulting you, just your hair," reiterating the hair's role as a symbol for Josuke's sense of self and confidence. The pair then have a bit of a fight, nothing too scary or dramatic, where we can see how their stand powers compare to each other. And Star Platinum is struggling here. Indeed, while it's short-lived, it's this fight that really gave me the feeling of Jotaro narratively needing to take a step aside to make way for the new successor, even if he is portrayed at the start as a bit vain and silly. I would have to argue though that the vanity and silliness are refreshing. As the girls say later in the scene, Jotaro is essentially scary and kind of hot. And I can't argue with that, of course, and I'm not mad at it. But that's all he is. Talking of successors, following this fight is a pretty strong symbolic moment in the passing of the Joestar torch. Jotaro's hat appears to have been smushed, and if you view the hat as a symbol, this moment crucially undermines his potency, his power, and infallibility as a hero. As a viewer, it's really hard to picture Jotaro without his hat, and it's a big part of his on-screen gravitas. So to see it smooshed and warped like this kind of brings it back down to earth a minute, and it's like, oh, it's just a hat, he can take it off at any time. So all in all, this section really drives home again and again that while Jotaro is still here, he's being taken down a peg or two. After all this action, we're cleverly brought back down to reality. We're shown a shot of the schoolgirls just standing there, and this effectively reminds us of where we are. We're in a small town where fights like these have witnesses. It's weird to see stuff like this day to day. In contrast, in Season 3, no fight really felt out of place. As I said before, Season 3 is more like a western, with a vast setting in which the immediate surroundings were disposable really, because our characters were always moving on to somewhere else. Whereas throughout Season 3, we're stuck in Morio, and constantly reminded that sudden outbursts of violence like this are weird, and I love that. It feels, as much as a show like JoJo can, like real life. Back to the narrative, at this point in the episode, we've established that Josuke is three things. Number one, that he's a more layered man than Jotaro. Number two, he's less mature. And number three, he's actually a force to be reckoned with. He could be just as powerful, if not more powerful, than Jotaro, and that's saying something. In fact, Jotaro was only able to stop the fight by using his power to stop time, and he does this because he thinks Josuke could actually really injure him. That's impressive work for an inexperienced stand user. So the fight's over and Jotaro gives Josuke the lowdown. He tells him that there's something evil hiding in the town and that the evil presence could be a stand user. And thus, our first antagonist is introduced, over halfway through the episode. And there's something about this pacing that just makes me happy. You know, I like things to be slow, at least at the start. Anyway, despite discovering that he's in grave danger, Josuke immediately gets distracted by Koichi telling him that school is about to start, which is quite funny. Josuke freaks out, not wanting to disappoint his mum for being late on his first day, because, you know, he's a sweetheart. But again, this sort of reminds us that he is, you know, a kid and he's a bit naive. Josuke's immaturity is summed up really well, I think, when Koichi describes him as unpredictable and a person who can go right from goofy to pissed off. This sort of unpredictableness and inconsistency of character is something that Josuke's mum also alludes to later in the episode. Indeed, Josuke has a lot of growing up to do here, and that's one of the things that makes him so endearing and intriguing as a person. Nevertheless, after their encounter, Jotaro concludes that while Josuke has a quote-unquote weird personality, he could prove to be a great ally. After the break, if there is one, there won't if you've been watching it illegally, and let's face it, you did, we see a young woman walking down the street. There's this man catcalling her from his car, and she decides to do something about it. She tells him to go to hell, which, you know, you might do, and then she does something a bit weird, shall we say. And thus we are introduced to who, in my opinion, is the best female character in all of JoJo. She's sexualized and even described as hot by the villain at the end of the episode, but she's also interesting. Refreshing, huh? I'd say the more even gender balance of characters in Season 4, and I mean a bit more even, is an improvement, especially after the male-dominated Season 3. But then again, I keep referring to Part 3 as a Western, and Westerns are traditionally devoid of women, because it was just a kind of man's environment. So there you go. And women in Season 5, well, that's a conversation for another time. Anyway, after this altercation, we'll call it, a policeman appears and takes the woman's side. We then even see him pick up a bag for this old lady. Morio sure seems like a nice place, huh? This short section, again, just kind of clearly demonstrates what a nice, cozy little place Morio is. If a guy's being a dick to you, you're gonna be okay. As Josuke's mum, Tomoko, talks with the policeman, we get a good summation of her son's character. She says of Josuke, that idiot can seem calm and then get pissed off out of nowhere. Though this idea of unpredictability can definitely be applied to Tomoko too, with her calm attitude after this sudden outburst of anger. Following this, we're introduced to our first minor antagonist, Angelo, in a way that's efficient, if not very interesting. We hear about Angelo's horrible crimes in a voiceover from Jotaro, who describes him as the most awful and disgusting criminal in Japan's history. Unlike the supernatural horrors we saw in previous seasons, this is the kind we're familiar with hearing about in real life. Of course, Season 1 did kind of deal with psychological torture with Theo, but that was quite a while ago now. And because of this, I remember this moment striking me the first time I saw it as like, damn, this is heavy stuff. We then get a nice shot of the school, again juxtaposing the ominous and the safe. And Josuke, understandably, doesn't want to leave the safety of this day-to-day life. We see him discussing Jotaro's news after school with Koichi, and he says that while he's curious, he doesn't want to get involved. This conversation is then interrupted by a couple of police cars driving past. The boys decide to follow the police to see what's going on, and the camera pans round to the body of a woman in the woods, who's clearly been killed by Angelo. Her body is pretty horrifically contorted here, and the pastels we just saw outside the school and in the street are now covered in darkness. And it is really in this latter part of the episode where we play with colour in amazing ways. When we reach the incident, the sky has changed to a sort of bluish-green sky with orange clouds. I love this combination because it kind of reminds me a bit of a poisonous reptile or something, but that could just be me. Certainly though, the colours clash here in a way that tells us something is wrong. Somebody in the crowd asks if a drama is being filmed, again emphasising just how protected from the world this little town is. People aren't used to seeing crimes every day. Apart from, we learn that a woman has been taken hostage by a man trying to rob a convenience store. But this is JoJo, of course, so we know there'll be more to this situation than meets the eye. The man comes out of the store holding a knife to the woman's throat, and Josuke and Koichi are watching and they kind of decide to just step away from the scene, until the man brandishes his knife at Josuke and calls him, "You with the stupid hair." The hair motif by this point has been used a lot in this episode. In fact, I wouldn't argue if you said it was a bit heavy-handed, however, it does its job. We know this comment will spur Josuke to become involved in the action. Josuke steps towards the man and we see the colours change again, this time to a darker and more poisonous combination of blue and purple. The whole frame is just so expressive, from the jewel colours to the low-angle Dutch shot, and it's just, it's so pretty. Not to mention that it's an effective way of creating a sense of darkness without actually having to use a lot of black or dark colours. Back to Josuke, he's really losing his cool here, just like Jotaro told him not to. And I was excited to notice that this bit subtly mirrors the part in the last episode of season 3 where Jotaro lost his cool even though Joseph told him not to. How about that? We love a parallel. The criminal threatens to stab the girl and we get another Dutch angle. This is a common technique in manga and anime which gives a very precarious anything could happen sort of effect. And it's here that we get my favourite nod to season 3 in the whole episode. Josuke's approaching the criminal, being pretty cocky, and the guy says, "You're pissing me off." We then see Shining Diamond intercepting by punching through both him and the woman. And this is when Josuke responds with, but we, as viewers, know that it's actually Jotaro's line, remembered particularly from his last battle with Dio. So throughout this episode, we do get nice little allusions to season 3, and in my opinion, they are allusions rather than like a, "Hey, remember when this happened?" But subconsciously, you are being reminded of season 3, and it just sort of helps you ease into the world of season 4. Unlike Jotaro's stand in his last battle with Dio, Josuke's move has not created complete destruction. The woman and the criminal appear to be healed. The army knife, however, is lodged in Angelo's stomach, which I thought was clever. He's prepared to punish him, but he's not prepared to kill him. If he was prepared to kill this man, he would no longer be the friend next door. He would be more like the sort of Greek mythical hero that Araki describes Jotaro as. Josuke then has a pretty strong moment when he's giving Angelo a verbal takedown, telling him that he'll need to get the knife surgically removed in the prison hospital. And that, I think, is the general theme of Josuke's stand and narrative power as a protagonist. He outsmarts people, he doesn't just destroy them. In addition, it is interesting to note that the colour scheme here takes on a cooler blue tone to suggest that Josuke has now cooled down a bit. I could honestly do a 10-minute video just on this scene because there are so many great things going on, even in just the colour and the angles. But these are the kind of main things that I noticed. But it doesn't end there. We then see a stand, which we later find is Aqua Necklace, threading Josuke before disappearing. And this just sets the viewer up comfortably with the promise of another stand-heavy season. As the episode comes to a close, Koichi reiterates that something evil is lurking in Morio, and we see somebody watching Josuke's home. The guy watching his house has that watery stand kind of snuggling up around his neck, and we get the promise of another meetup between Josuke and Jotaro as well. I liked this because it reassures the viewer that Jotaro didn't just appear as an establishing plot device. It's awful as a viewer when you see an old beloved character appear at the start of a new season only to disappear again. It's so frustrating, and I'm looking at you, Part 5, why did you have to do that? There's definitely a big atmosphere of foreboding undercutting the domesticity at the end of this episode, but the lasting effect is that of a cozy, comforting feeling. Indeed, Part 4 looks different, but with an aesthetic that has meaning and is clearly thought out. Our new hero too is a surprise, but he's really interesting and he fits right into the JoJo family tree. Furthermore, our new setting is clearly going to be home for the foreseeable future, and moreover, this hunk is gonna stick around. Ultimately though, Josuke is the key element which signals an exciting new direction for JoJo. He's naive, and he's not your typical macho hero. But as I've argued, he's more evolved and therefore perhaps more lovable than his predecessors. Eventually, he wins over even the stoically masculine Jotaro, which is quite a feat. All the elements I've discussed though come together to guide us into this new world that Araki himself describes as a sort of closed city. Without a doubt, sticking to this more closed-off and intimate place is what leads to some great experimentation and narrative problem-solving as the series develops. Moreover, it arguably leads to a deeper connection with the viewer as they follow this more evolved JoJo through what's essentially his coming of age. It's well known that limitation often leads to better creation, and Season 4 is a testament to just that. Anyway guys, I think that's about it. I'm gonna go curl up somewhere because this video took a hot minute to make. I really enjoyed making it though, and I hope that you did as well. If you did, please do give it a like and subscribe for future content, and also leave a comment if you want as well. That would be just brilliant. Maybe let me know who your favourite character in Season 4 is, and why it's Okuyasu. Just look at his stupid little face. But seriously, thank you again if you did make it this far. I'm sending love. This is nottacat, signing off.